All right. What I'm going to try to do is build on Emil's comments and address four main issues. The first is elaborate on some of the key features of what we mean by security sector reform. Then to talk about why. Why is this a priority for Africa? Third is to talk about how does this benefit security sector institutions in Africa. And then four, what do you do when there's little or no political will among the political leadership for security sector reform? What can be done? So the first point about just what are some of the main features, Emil did a good job of reviewing what the different definitions are out there. I think the main takeaway is while the definitions vary, most of the major institutions have very similar ideas what the concepts are. That being said, I think it's really important whenever you engage the concept in your own countries to be clear with your colleagues just what are we talking about. Because every time I've been part of a SSR process, the people who are involved, not just the national actors, but international actors, often come in with very different understandings of what SSR is. And so it's important to be clear on the understanding of what you're trying to do as you engage in this process. So based on those experiences, let me draw out a couple of the key features of what SSR is. The first is SSR is a process. All right, it's a process. It's not a product. It's not an initiative. It's not a program. It's something that is part of an ongoing dialogue with multiple stakeholders who have stakes in security for a country. And so in that way, it's interministerial. It goes beyond the traditional security sector units of the police and the army. It has civilian actors. It involves parliament. It involves regional and some subnational security actors. And it involves citizens and the media. And a critical element of this process is how you go about it. In many ways, the process of how you involve all these participants is as important as any products that are generated. Because that participatory process is what creates the legitimacy for any of the outcomes that are realized. Because this is a process usually that takes place over a period of years and involves multiple stakeholders, political will is often very critical for successfully sustaining a security sector reform process. You will want to have commitment from the political leadership as well as leaders within the security sector. A second key feature of security sector reform that I would emphasize is that it's more than about building capacity, but it's a matter of enhancing governance of the security sector. Indeed, many of the questions that you'll be grappling with are about identifying priorities, interest, the allocation of resources, force formulations within the security sector. These are governance issues. And that's why some people like to call the concept security sector governance rather than security sector reform. It's the same concept, but people are putting different emphases on it. In fact, one scholar said that in security sector reform or governance, the focus is not just on ensuring a monopoly of force, but on a monopoly of legitimacy within the security sector. All right, some things that security sector reform is not also helps us understand this concept. The first is that security sector reform is about more than just effectiveness. It's also about accountability. In this way, security sector reform is different than traditional capacity building initiatives or training and equip initiatives. It's trying to get at and strengthening the oversight of the security sector so that it is advancing the interest and priorities of a civilian population, as well as the state. Security sector reform is not the same thing as defense sector reform. The security sector is broader than just the Army. And especially in Africa today, where many of the security threats are emerging from within society, it necessarily needs to be interministerial. Security sector reform is not about downsizing, as is often presented. It's more about optimizing. How do you adjust the security sector structures so that they are best adapted to the security threats that you're facing within a particular society? Security sector reform is not externally driven. The intent is that this has to be a nationally owned process. Now, external actors can help with technical assistance, financial support. They can help share experiences from other places. In the end, the process has to be owned by national actors, because each security sector reform process is going to be unique to that individual context. And lastly, security sector reform is not a one-size-fits-all initiative. Again, as I had just said, it is going to have to be customized to the unique circumstances of each particular society. And I would like to build on Emil's reference to Sierra Leone as an illustration, often cited for an example of a comprehensive security sector reform process. And when the Sierra Leoneans engaged on this in their post-conflict environment, they tried to do three things. They tried to evaluate the threats. Secondly, they wanted to identify the relevant institutions to counter these threats. And then third, they wanted to develop appropriate and affordable strategies to combat the threats that they faced. One of the unique aspects of the Sierra Leone process is that they purposely tried to target 5 different clusters of security sector actors. The first, of course, was the core security actors, the military and police. Second was the civil management and oversight bodies, the ministries, the legislature, the financial management bodies. Third was justice and rule of law institutions, such as the Ministry of Justice, Correction Services, the judiciary, anti-corruption commissions. Third were non-statutory security forces, militias, basically, some private security companies. And then fourth was civil society, including the media. And some of the highlights of their process, and the process went on in different phases for over a decade. Some of the highlights were that they undertook a very thorough security sector review that was highly participatory. It was a 2-year process that very much engaged the communities. It got down into the villages and had engagements so that there was a broad conversation about what security should be in Sierra Leone. There was also a purposeful effort to build the capacity of some of the civilian structures, like Parliament, like the media, so they could do a better job of having this dialogue and then talking about it and contributing to it from a policy perspective. And it's this comprehensive nature of the Sierra Leonean process that led to the term security sector transformation. Now, some of the results from the Sierra Leone process was that it firmly embedded the security sector effort in Sierra Leone with the national goal of development. So the purpose of the security sector effort was to ensure that the state and the country was stable enough to advance development. So this provided conceptual clarity and a common security vision that was lacking previously. It also led to a reprofessionalization of the security sector, especially the police. And it reoriented the intelligence sector, which is often neglected when we talk about security sector, but it reoriented the intelligence units to focus on citizen security rather than just regime security. And finally, it elevated the importance of an Office of National Security so that there was a coordinating body among all the different institutions that are involved in security sector advancement in Sierra Leone. And because of the way that the process was pursued, it really was a locally owned effort, and the reputation for the security sector in Sierra Leone was enhanced as a result. So that's some of the key features that I would hold up for security sector reform. Let me talk now about why this is a priority for Africa. And there's a number of reasons that I would throw out. First is that with the spread of democratic ideals on the continent, there are changing expectations from citizens about the role and functions of the security sector. And there is this shift taking place that security is about security of the citizen, not just security of the regime. There's also a growing recognition that security affects everybody. And so the stakeholders are broader than just the core security sector actors. There need to be civilians involved. There are valid questions from security, from civil society and ordinary citizens that need to be brought out. Another reason is that the nature of the security threats in Africa are changing, as you have been talking about this past week, with many of these threats being internal threats from non-state actors. These are different than the traditional external threats for which many militaries in Africa have been created. And so this requires a rethinking about how best to align force structures so that they meet these threats. And this will then have ripple effects for your training regimen. As we see regularly, we don't want to be sending African militaries to deal with domestic security challenges when they don't have the training, because the way that they're going to do that could actually be damaging for their reputation. It could be harmful to the communities, and in the end, it is counterproductive. Now, because of the nature of these internal security threats, today, Africa's security sector is reliant on having close cooperation with communities than ever before. You need to have that trusting, cooperative relationship to deal with these irregular forces. Unfortunately, in many places in Africa, that level of trust is starting from a very low place. Some recent Afrobarometer surveys show that on average, from the countries that were surveyed, 31% of African citizens have little or no trust in their militaries. 46% feel the same way about the police. In fact, some people report that their biggest fear is, for their personal security, is from the security sector. Similar perceptions come up with regards to corruption. The survey for police suggests that 48% of respondents feel police are corrupt. So to get that cooperation, there's going to have to be a stronger degree of trust between the security sector and the civilian population. Another reason why this is important is that many African countries are emerging from conflict. And so there's a need to reconstitute or reprofessionalize the force, to rebuild its reputation, and to decide questions about what does this force look like, how do you, or whether you should integrate militias into the standing force. All those questions need to be sorted out. In other circumstances, you may have had peacekeepers on the ground from the AU or UN. They're planning to pull out. What does that mean for how those responsibilities are going to be picked up by the domestic security forces? And then finally, I would throw out that even without any sort of post-conflict or crisis situation, Africa security forces face a daunting challenge on a day-to-day basis where you're being asked to provide security often over highly expansive areas of territory in rugged terrain with limited resources. That's a challenge that probably no other region in the world faces to quite the same extent. And so thinking about how you optimize, how you are most efficient with your resources is as critical in Africa as anywhere in the world. All right, so that talks about some of the reasons why security sector reform is a priority in Africa. Sometimes I'll get questions about, well, why should we do this within the security sector? How is this in our interest? Reform is often an arduous process. Why should we make the effort to do this? And so I'd throw out a couple of ideas here that I think are worth considering. Perhaps most importantly is some research shows that security sector reform contributes to better security. In fact, a review of all post-conflict contexts since 1990 finds that changes to security sector governance that broaden civilian oversight and reduces factional control of the security sector reduces the chance that civil war recurs in those societies. Security sector reform also leads to better conceptual clarity and a more common vision of what security should be in a society. And in this way, it provides a stronger rationale for the security sector and therefore more support from the general public. Security sector reform also contributes to more coordination between the multiple institutions that are involved in the process, as well as enhancing their professionalization. So a good example of this that I would highlight is from Uganda. In the late 1990s, Uganda's military's budget had just been cut by the World Bank and IMF as part of conditionality that they were facing. It was fighting the LRA in the north. It had other sundry security threats that it was dealing with. Yet the military was in a state of inertia. There was no clear command and administrative structure. There were few written policies or guidelines. There's inadequate training. The forces were rife with ethnic divisions. Many of the foot soldiers had limited levels of literacy, and commanders lacked a strategic vision. And so they decided to embark on the security sector reform process, and again, they undertook a 2-year defense sector review. And it was based on three principles. One was comprehensiveness, second was inclusiveness, and third was transparency. Their process was led by the Ministry of Defense, but with cooperation of other ministries, parliament, academia, and civil society. And it went through three major phases. But the result was that they were able to institutionalize their planning functions. They created and strengthened an inspectorate function. They strengthened their training capacity regimen. And they developed and enhanced mission support functions for procurement, for financial management, for civil military relations. They laid out capital expenditures in support of the security sector. All in all, the process put Uganda's security sector, especially the UPDF, on a path to being one of the most capable and professional forces on the continent. And importantly, by involving Parliament and the general public, this process created a clear justification for the security sector in government budgeting that had previously existed. And so while it was initially capped at 2% of GDP, as a result of this process, it grew to 5.2%. And it was seen as a worthy investment for the government and the society to make because of the shared commitment to security. So let me turn now to the fourth point that I have on political will. I've mentioned several times political will is important for successful security sector reform processes. You need that commitment on the part of political leadership and security sector leadership. But what do you do when it's not there? And to be frank, often, especially when emerging from crisis situations, that political will is lacking. It is limited. And there's a need to try to advance these interests even when not everybody has come around with the importance of the concept. And I would say, yes, it is challenging. Yes, it limits what you can do. But there are a number of priorities that I would emphasize that can be done. I think the first is to recognize that political will is not a static concept. Political will changes, and it's shaped by the individuals, interests, institutions that are out there. And to the extent that political leaders understand how a certain reform process may benefit them, they can change their position. Second, I would emphasize the importance of investing in people over assets. That much progress with limited expense can be made by focusing on attitudes, discipline, and ethos of the security sector personnel. And this helps develop a sense of pride and duty and respect for the role of the security sector that creates an important foundation for reform, and in many ways preparing these institutions for a more expansive security sector reform effort. I think complementing this, when resources allow, there's high value in supporting professional military institutions, both domestically and externally. These help expose officers to the values of professional security services, which they can then share and bring back home. Another point of emphasis is the value of, to the extent possible, establishing merit-based hiring and promotion procedures. This fosters a culture of professionalism within the security sector. And it helps to create buffers between the political leadership and your security sector leaders. To the extent that security sector leaders recognize this, then they can take a longer planning horizon in leading their respective security forces. Another point of emphasis in situations of limited political will is the importance of involving legislators and civil society and the media. What this does is create more stakeholders in the process, which helps create more momentum, which also limits the opportunity that reform process can be derailed. And this is all part of a process and the importance of creating a dialogue about reform. When there is a shared recognition of a common security threat, that provides a strong incentive to move forward, to create some new processes that can deal with that threat. And this may benefit from exposure from external actors. In the case of Burundi, they relied heavily on some Senegalese security sector professionals who were able to give a different perspective than the Burundians had. And in fact, sometimes it's just the process of dialogue helps people to understand what security sector reform is about. As we said at the beginning, not everybody has that same understanding. And because in many countries they haven't undergone this process previously, they don't know what it is about. And there's a quote from a Burundian stakeholder that I think is revealing in this way. He said, when people do not understand something, their default position is to say no. Once they understand why change is needed and how they can support the process of change, they can become more open to it. So the last point I would throw out about what you can do in periods of lack of political will is the importance of trust building. And this is especially true in post-conflict situations. There's a polarized society, potentially a polarized security sector. Before you can talk about reform, you need to talk about rebuilding trust and reconciliation. And when that process is underway, then you open the door to other initiatives. And again, Burundi provides a good example here. The initial efforts of their security sector reform process focused on improving living conditions for their armed forces, basic needs, helping to ensure people had essential cooking materials, regularized payments. All of these things created the trust that opened the door for larger conversation about ethnicity, training, and public engagement. And in fact, I don't think it was in your reading package, but we have a security brief on the table here on the security sector reform process in Burundi that I recommend for everybody. So, in conclusion, security sector reform is a iterative process. There are multiple steps that need to be taken along the way, but it is potentially an indispensable process because it gives a strategic framework to think about all the other initiatives that go into a security sector development, whether that be national security strategy, whether that be DDR types of activities, whether it be your force structure formation, whether it be your training priorities, whether it be procurement. Your SSR process gives you that framework to think about how these things come together and what your priorities are. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much.